Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 5, Lesson 4, Splines and Camera Movement. The objectives for this lesson are to add a player ship mesh, explain the spline component, demonstrate creating a spline, demonstrate moving the camera along the spline, and then creating the ship's autopilot. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of this cone here that we've been using for our ship. And here's this one that I found on TurboSquid, and it's made by someone named CG Pitbull. This one is free to use for your game, and this is the one that I'll be using. There's also another one on TurboSquid from someone named GraphicsBox, and this one is also free to use for your game. And both these content creators have many other models that you can use that are paid, or you can try to find one from another website for free, or even a paid one from another website. But there's these two free ones that you can use just to get started. And just to keep my project nice and clean, I'm going to create another new folder in my content folder called models, and I'll upload it here. And in player ship, I'm just going to change the mesh that looks pretty good, but maybe it's a little too small. And I think that's good. And now that we have a ship in the game that we can use, the next thing I want to do is start moving the camera through the level. Now, there are multiple ways you can do this. You could, for instance, just go into the camera class and set some function to move it along a certain axis. But for my game, what I really want is to be able to move the camera in a very dynamic way that could maybe weave around some obstacles. For instance, if you're having your game go through a desert canyon, you wouldn't want it to just move along a straight line. You'd want it to move naturally through that canyon, or through a city skyline where you're trying to dodge buildings. And trying to do this by just moving the camera along a certain axis would create a lot of extra work and a lot of functions. So for my game, what I'm going to be using is a spline, and I'm going to move the camera along the spline. So what is a spline? A spline is a component in Unreal Engine that allows you to define a path. And a spline contains at least 2 points, but points can be added, removed, or animated. And a spline can be modified in the level editor during runtime. And down here at the bottom is just a few examples of how a spline could be used. So let's create a spline in our level. In our place actors, we can actually just type spline, and we'll get a spline mesh actor, and we can drag this into the level. And if we zoom in, we can see that this spline has 2 points, and that those points can be edited. And that allows us to impact the curve. So let's delete this spline from our scene, and I want to create a new blueprint class. And this will be an actor, and we'll call this BP track. In here, I want to add a component, and that's going to be a spline. And we want to select utility spline. And let's call this the track. Now if we drag one of these in, we can see that it has the spline attached to it. Let's set the location to 0, 0, 0. And this will mean that the starting point of our spline is in the exact same location as our player start. Now we can drag the end of this spline somewhere out into the level. And here's a few things that you can do. With our endpoint selected, you'll notice that there's 2 new points that we can now select. These allow us to edit this point. So if we grab this endpoint here, we can drag it around, and we can see that the spline is now creating some type of curve. Also with our endpoint selected, we can right click and say duplicate spline point. And now we've added a 3rd point to our spline. And we can use this to create a very dynamic curve that goes through the level. And you'll notice on our details panel that we have this widget that allows us to move through our spline point by point. We can also add new spline points. We can go to the last spline point. So there's a lot of flexibility here to create a very dynamic line or curve through your level. And we can also delete a spline point if we would like as well. We can right click and say delete spline point, and now our spline only has 2 points again. I'm going to leave my spline just having 2 points for now, just to keep things a little bit simple while we set up the next part. And this is that we want to move our camera along this spline through the level. In our BP camera, let's set up a new custom event. I'm going to call this follow track. And in here, let's get actor BP track. And let's set this as a variable called track. Now dragging off this pin, let's say get spline, and we see get spline length of track. So this found our track, which is our spline component in BP track, and there's a node called get spline length. Let's also set this as a variable called track length. And in order to move along the track, I'm going to use a timeline. And I'm going to call this track timeline. So the next thing I want to do is get my default route, and we'll get a reference to that. I want to say set world, location, and rotation. And let's drag this into our update. So now as we move along this timeline, we're going to be setting the location and rotation of our BP camera. So we'll need to get these inputs here. And we know we want the starting location and rotation to be the same as the player start, or wherever BP camera came into the level. So we can actually get a reference to this and then use it as a variable. So let's say get world location of our scene route, and then we can drag off here and promote it to a variable, and we'll call it starting location. So we actually need to find that endpoint of our spline. So let's grab our track, and there are 2 nodes that we're going to use for this. So we want to drag off of here and say get location, and there's a node called get location at distance along spline. And what this will do is it will find our spline at a distance along that spline, and then it will return the location. And there's a similar one for get rotation. These 2 will be our inputs to set world location and rotation. And now we want to create a lerp. So let's drag off here and say lerp float. And this will be the input to both of these. And the A point of our lerp will be 0 because we want to start at the location at distance along spline and rotation at distance along spline of 0, which would be the starting point. And the B is going to be our track length, which would be the end of the spline. The last thing we need for this lerp is an alpha. So let's go into our timeline, and we'll create a track, a float track, and we'll just call this alpha. We'll set our 2 points at 0, 0 and 1, 1, and make sure the length is set to 1. And now we can drag this into here. And now let's call follow track right after spawn ship. And just to clean this up, first I'm going to drag these first few, I'm going to collapse to a function. I'm going to call this set track variables. And I also want to set one more thing, and that's the speed at which we can move along this track. We'll notice that it is actually working right now, but if we press play, we're moving along the track way too quickly for it to keep up. So right after this, let's do track timeline. And we can actually get a reference to this timeline. Then we can say set play rate, and this will set the rate at which the timeline is played. And for the rate, we can set the amount of time that we want the level to take. So let's drag off here and type divide. And we want to divide 1 by a number. Let's drag off of here and promote to a variable. And we'll call this level duration. And let's set that to something like 60 seconds. So now this level duration will be a time at which it will take us to get through the entire timeline or along the spline. And by dividing 1 by the duration, we're setting the play rate of our timeline to divide the alpha by the number of seconds. Let's press play and show what this looks like. So now we can see that we're moving through our level and we can still move our ship. And if our ship gets to the bottom, our bump will keep it on the screen. And just to show that this will follow our spline, let's create a new point on our spline. And just to speed this up, let's make our level duration something shorter, like 10 seconds. Now our camera is moving along that spline in the level. But if we notice, our ship didn't change the rotation when we hit that spline point. It was still pointing in the same direction. And we can fix this by off of begin play, get actor, and we'll find our player camera. And let's set this as a variable. Now here on event tick, we can take our capsule and say set world rotation, and the input to this will be our rotation of our camera. Now we can see that the rotation of our ship matches the rotation of the camera. But for my game, just to keep things simple for now, I'm going to have the track just go along a straight line. In your game, you can experiment with doing things other ways, but I recommend, at least for this first portion of the game, while we're just setting up all the features, that we keep it as a straight line just to make sure all of our other functionality is working. And the last thing I want to do is that in our game, it feels weird that our ship isn't moving along with the camera. So I'm going to set up an autopilot, or something that moves the ship along through the level so that I don't have to be constantly pressing the W key. So let's create a new function. I'm going to call this autopilot. I'm going to call this on event tick right after we're setting our rotation. And in here, we want to say set world location. And we want to get our world location and add some value to that. And we want to add a forward vector value. So we'll say get forward vector and multiply it by some number to get a distance directly ahead of the player and then move to that location. And what is the distance? Well, we want it to be dynamic based upon the track length. So if we get our camera, say get track length, and we also want it to be dependent upon that level duration, so say get level duration. And so here we want to make some type of calculation based upon the track length and the duration. We can use length divided by time to create some type of miles per hour. So let's divide here, and we'll connect this. And for the duration, we actually want to multiply. And the number I found is that 60 seems to work. I think it has something to do with the timing. I don't know exactly why, but this will end up working. So track length divided by level duration times 60. And we're going to multiply that by our forward vector to get some distance ahead of the ship. And then we're going to add it to the current location of our ship to get a new world location. And this will create an autopilot function. Let's just clean this up by collapsing this to a function. And this can be a pure function, and we'll call it get autopilot speed. Now, I'd also like to have the ability to turn autopilot on and off. This will allow the player to navigate some situations where maybe things are a little bit tighter and they don't want the ship to be moving automatically. So let's put a branch here, and let's pull off this, and we'll promote this to a variable, and we'll call this autopilot on. And that way, if they want to turn the autopilot off, this will just do nothing. So let's set up a new key in project settings, input. I'm going to use V for mine. So here in the player camera, let's set up our autopilot, and I'll just set this up really quick. So now if our autopilot is on, we'll set it to off, and if it is off, we'll set it to on. And we can see there that when we toggle it, our ship will stop moving, and we turn it back on again, our ship will start moving along with the camera, and we can toggle this. And this also means that when we get to the end of our timeline track, we can also stop the autopilot. And that's it. We set up our camera to move along the spline, and we also set our player ship to move along with the camera using an autopilot function, and we also match the rotation of the camera with our player ship. And now that we've completed all the movement functions of our ship, it's time to get started on the weapons, and we'll start this in our next lesson.